Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Kristen Henning, who is the Bloom Professor of Law and the Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she supervises law students and represents youth accused of delinquency in the DC Superior Court. Professor Henning served as the law school's Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning from 2017 to 2020. And she joins us today to talk about her important book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Of The Rage of Innocence, our friend Paul Butler writes a vivid and engaging account of how Black children don't get to be children in the eyes of the police, politicians, and sometimes their own teachers. Henning, a star defense attorney and law professor, tells stories in and out of school of how the new Jim Crow targets Black boys and girls, tears apart families. Lucid analysis from a brilliant scholar at the top of her game, The Rage of Innocence blesses readers with common sense solutions that provide hope that we can do better for our children and our democracy. How are you doing today, Professor Henning?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
So you obviously have been doing this work in the trenches for some time. At what point did you think it was important that readers get a deeper sense of the humanity, right, and the loss of humanity that's occurring, in our criminal justice system and our schools as it relates to Black youth?
I got to say, it is hard to do this work for very long and not want to blow up the system, to be quite frank. And for me, I have been representing children in the nation's capital for 26 years. And in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white children. Every other child I have represented has been African American. That should cause every single one of us to just stop in our tracks. And, for folks who don't live in the nation's capital, maybe you're thinking that there are no white kids here. You would be wrong. Right. Or maybe you're thinking that white children don't commit crimes. You would also be wrong. And so truly, I had a number of just aha moments in my career, and I really wanted folks to see and grapple with the ways in which there are such extreme racial disparities in our system all across the country, and to think about what the impact must be on Black and brown children who are criminalized. And I mean, what's the psychological impact, emotional impact, physical impact on Black and brown children. And so that's really what I wanted to put out there for folks to grapple with and to tell it through a series of stories and matching those stories with research and data. It's stories of our young people that should move hearts and minds. But sometimes folks need the data. Sometimes folks need the research, but I try to do so in a way that's accessible and engaging for readers.
That you do. There's a way in which you could have been done with the book just with the first story about the Molotov cocktail, because it just says so much of how we think about Black and white teenagers. The mother who stops you and goes, "They stopped my kid too."
Right.
And so you have the Black boy who has to go through the criminal justice system for something that doesn't, for a Molotov cocktail that doesn't even work.
That's right. That's right.
Right. That he just basically forgot in his bag. And the white mother's like, "Yeah, my son did that too." And they put him in a chemistry class.
That's right. That's right. And look, Mark, would it help me even for me to just tell that story for all your listeners who haven't picked up the book, right?
Absolutely.
So, I think you're absolutely right. It is, for me, the perfect moment, one of my absolute aha moments. So I represented Eric, who's a 13-year-old boy who on a Saturday night was watching a movie. And in the movie, he sees someone with a Molotov cocktail. And in his 13-year-old brain, he says, "Oh, that looks cool. Let me see if I can make something, right? That looks like that." He doesn't research it. He doesn't ask anybody about it. He runs into his kitchen and he grabs a glass bottle and begins to pour whatever liquids he can find. Pine Sol, bleach, water, whatever, right? liquids that together and alone just are not going to be flammable. And so he closes up the top. And before he does this is my favorite part of the story. He grabs a piece of toilet paper and he runs the toilet paper from the inside of the bottle to the outside. And then he closes up the top. And we know that this toilet paper is going to burn out long before it even gets to the top, right? But he tapes it up so that it looks like a Molotov cocktail, and he plays with it, forgets all about it. Right, puts it in his book bag so that it doesn't spill out on his mother's white carpet. Monday morning, he hasn't, thought about it in like 2 days, and his mother drives him to school, and he puts his book bag through the metal detector, and a school police officer says to him, "What is this?" To which he immediately says, "Oh, that's nothing. You can throw that away." And he goes on to class. Little does he know that is the beginning of a 9-month ordeal in juvenile court. Police officers show up, arson, the fire department, arson specialists show up. They yank him out of class, evacuate the school. It's just the craziest thing, right? So then, look, no one gives him the benefit of the doubt at all. And then, as you said, Mark, sometime later, I am giving a talk in Connecticut, and I'm telling this story. At the end of the talk, someone comes up to me, a white woman comes up to me, and she says, "My son did the exact same thing." And I ask her, "Well, what happened to him?" And she says that he gets placed in advanced science classes. What an extraordinary contrast, right? And it was just a moment when you realize, for me, all the themes, as you say, all the themes of the book are just, really amplified by that one story. Everything from the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors, and especially for Black and brown children, who just get the absolute no benefit of the doubt whatsoever in this scenario. The ways in which we over rely on traditional law enforcement responses to regulate adolescence. So even, if he shouldn't have had the bottle in the school, this is not a way in which we respond to a white kid who brings a bottle to school. The story, Eric's story, is also a clear depiction of how schools aren't safe anymore for Black and brown children. And it's not that they're not safe because of violence, by other students. It's not safe because of, this culture of perceiving and treating Black and brown children as criminal.
There are times, when I'm in class with the students here at Duke, and I'll joke with them that if you were to Google search the term teenager or 19-year-old, that the first definition that comes up is "does stupid things." Right. And I'm talking about this in relation to 19 and 20-year-old college students, right? Not 13, 14, and 15-year-olds. Right. You talk early in the book about the fact that we have such a faulty understanding of what adolescence is, that we forget what it is, that what we see as normative, as what we should see as normative adolescent behavior gets racialized. That's right. Right. And so, I always think of those images of the little white male walking around with fireman boots, and it's 95 degrees outside and it's the middle of July, right? And he knows he can do that because he has the latitude. Absolutely. To do that, right. Black kids never have that kind of latitude just simply to be children or simply to be adolescents, in that context. So talk a little bit about, what it was like trying to frame an understanding of the history of adolescence, right? You talk about, when adolescence becomes a term, and how that shifted over the years as it become racialized, particularly in the last 20 years or so.
One of the things that I learned a lot writing this book. I've been doing the work for all these years, and it isn't until you write a book like this that you begin to dig in on some of those questions. Yeah. And one of those questions was the history of adolescence and the really recognition that we all need, that adolescence is a privilege. And so historically, growing up, I always understood adolescence to be one of the 3 distinct stages of development. But I come to find out it's actually a relatively new concept. Before the Industrial Revolution, we as a country thought about adolescence in 2 stages, we thought about development in 2 stages, childhood and adulthood. But then during the Industrial Revolution, it became clear that young people, or that the jobs that were going to be available required advanced skill sets and extended academic learning. And so in order to prepare their children to receive and to qualify for these new jobs, wealthy families began holding their children back from the fields. We were a previously agricultural community, but parents began to hold their children back. And we see an increase in elementary school and secondary school enrollment. We see the rise of professional schools. And so truly, we have this newly created season of adolescence, this prolonged period of social and academic freedom, an opportunity to engage in adventure and experimentation without the responsibilities of work. But who benefits? Who benefits from this extended period of development? It is, wealthy, white youth who get that benefit, and Black youth were excluded pretty early on. So it's really important to think about adolescence as a privilege, as a property, as a commodity that we value now, but that Black children have been traditionally excluded from it. But then we get, as a result of the shifting culture, we get mandatory schooling. So kids are sent to school, even Black kids are sent to school. Segregated schools, but they're sent to schools, right? And so now we think about other ways in which Black and brown children are excluded from that privilege, that unique benefit of this extended and prolonged period of development and freedom. And one of the ways in which we do that is through criminalization, right? So you demonize them, you consider them threatening, you put them behind bars, and they don't have the basic privileges of adolescent recreation, play, and leisure. That was another thing that I learned during the course of this research. Yes, I think about all of us who just take for granted the opportunity to relax, particularly in a pandemic and all of the stress and the anxiety. We could not function if we didn't stop and breathe and relax. Think about how incredibly even more important than this season of play, leisure, and recreation is for young people. It teaches leadership skills. Absolutely. It teaches, how to social emotional engagement. It's physical, right? Kids like Tamir Rice need to be outside at a park playing, right? It's absolutely essential for healthy adolescent development. And we've just taken it for granted. And now we deprive Black and brown children of the opportunity to be adolescents and to play, to have that physical and social development that is so incredibly important. And it's completely racialized from the beginning till the end.
You mentioned Tamir Rice, obviously a young Black boy, 12 years old, who was shot by the cops in a strikingly quick fashion in November of 2014. I remember shortly after Tamir's shooting, watching, because the Christmas season was coming, and watching the Christmas story. Right, which is about the little white boy who wants a BB gun. His parents are like, they're going to shoot your eyes out, right? And the striking difference, right? The 12-year-old white boy who wants a BB gun, and no one cares if that's threatening or dangerous or anything, and a 12-year-old Black boy, 50 years later, playing with a toy gun, right? Who doesn't get the same benefit of the doubt. Two things come to mind when we think about Tamir Rice. The reports of him being big for his age.
Right.
What the hell does that mean? Right. He's 12 years old. He's, almost 6 feet. He's, 175 pounds.
Right.
The inability for the criminal justice system in schools to treat Black children as children, and the inability to actually see them as children. Right. So that's the first part of it. But the second part that you missed to play, right? His mother doesn't want this boy locked up in the house, right? So he's just outside letting off some steam.
That's right.
The same way that, fraternities at universities after football games,
that's right.
Let off steam and destroy 15 cars, and break windows, right? And none of those folks end up incarcerated or dead.
That's right.
This child isn't given the benefit to even be asked what he's doing. Talk a little bit about this dynamic with someone like Tamir, and also how important play is and when it's denied to Black children, and the inability for folks to see Black children as simply being children.
Really beautiful set of questions. I mean, there's so many, threads that we could pull from this.
Absolutely.
And so, maybe I'll hit that historical piece right at the outset, that America has a long history of failing to see Black children as children. And the early iterations of failing to see and treat Black children as children served some important utilitarian functions in our country, right? So obviously, during the era of slavery, Black children were treated as the property of the purported master. We get to the civil rights era, and you can have an Emmett Till lynched at the age of 14, very much as a symbolic statement that we will not tolerate, that white America will not tolerate integration of schools. So, Emmett Till is lynched in this era where folks, power holders in our country, are dead set on policing and limiting the boundaries of whiteness, right? Of protecting their space. And so the only way in which you can justify the lynching of a 14-year-old and the treatment of Black children as property is to demonize them, right? You have to paint them as a threat. And so in Emmett Till's case, he's painted as a threat to white women, right? The whistling at the white woman is the perceived threat. Then we move into the 1990s and we see this temporary uptick in crime in the late 80s and the early 90s. Politicians realize that there is real gain to be made, political gain to be made, by manipulating that link between the purported link between Blackness and criminality. And so again, you've got these narratives, these demonized narratives of the super predator. That's right. That's exactly right. The super predator myth, which then creates this justification for criminalizing, and failing to treat Black children as children. So you've got these three sort of distinct eras when the narrative is crafted and constructed in a way for political, economic, and social gain for white folks. So why do I go back to that history? Because today, and when a Tamir Rice is killed, and when a Trayvon is killed by a pseudo, officer, it is in large part because the narratives of the past live on in the American psyche to make every one of us afraid of Black children. And I say us, meaning we as society. If we are honest, right? Even folks who are woke, even folks who are committed to democratic principles of racial equity, even some folks within the same race, you walk in a park and you see a group of Black kids, you're automatically afraid. And why is that? It is because that narrative that was intentionally crafted now lives on and makes folks afraid, which goes to your point then about adultification. This idea that, folks, police officers saw and talked about Tamir Rice as being older. He looked older than his 12-year-old baby face clearly indicates. And the research by folks like Dr. Philip Atiba Goff demonstrate, right, that folks tend to perceive Black children, both civilians and police officers tend to perceive Black youth as 4.5, actually more than 4.5 years older than they actually are, right? Has a profound impact on how we react, how we treat them in the schools, how we fear them in the community, how we respond to them when they have a toy gun. So all of this has both historical roots and then contemporary roots in our own racial biases that have been empirically demonstrated.
It's hard not to be frustrated at some of these, realities. because they have all kinds of implications. I mean, when you describe the way that Black youth are dealt with in the early 20th century, right, it has ramifications in terms of how Black parents parent.
Yes.
Right. So, even in the case of Tamir Rice, his mother has probably, it was not the first time she had to be concerned about her son going out to play, and not simply because there might be a gang somewhere, but because of the interaction with police, right? The way that Black parents historically have parented to the reality
yes.
of police occupation in Black communities, right? We know it as a talk in some cases. It also meant to a certain kind of almost draconian parenting style. Right, because you had to remind your kids, particularly you think about Emmett Till's generation, right? You had to remind your son when he went out to the street that there couldn't be any reckless eyeballing because you could end up dead because of that, right? And as a parent, you got to go into your toolbox and find all kinds of ways, right, to deal with those kind of realities. What happens then when the cops are in the school? So I have two daughters, a 22-year-old who graduated from University of North Chicago, who's living in Chicago, 19-year-old who's an undergraduate student at a HBCU here in North Carolina. I had never heard of school resource officers until we moved to North Carolina in 2004.
That's right.
I remember security guards. They were rarely armed. I grew up in New York City, so I might even remember when I was teaching in New York City, that there were metal detectors, right? But I didn't think of it as almost a police presence.
Right.
But this is something that's become a reality in our schools. And as you write in the book, primarily in Black and Brown communities. Talk about the history of the school resource officer and what does it mean that when minor infractions take place in school, that there's always a police presence there for something that ultimately might be simply a behavioral issue.
Yes, so that's yet another thing that I learned in writing the book, and honestly, I felt like I should have known it before I started writing, but I didn't. I bought into the long told or often repeated narrative that we have police in schools because parents and teachers were afraid to send their children to school after the mass shooting after Columbine, right? Which was in 1999. But when you go back and you look at that research, we realize that the first police officer in school appeared in 1939 in Indianapolis at the first inkling of a conversation about the possibility of school integration, okay? And then, again, fast forwarding to the Civil Rights era, on the heels of Brown versus Board of Education, we see that police in schools increase exponentially under the guise of being sent to facilitate the safe integration of Black students in school. We know of Black and Brown students in school, and we know from the iconic photographs and from the historical record that in so many instances, the officers were an impediment to that integration instead of an aid to that integration effort. And then here's what we really have to think about, that we have the formation of the National Association of School Resource Officers in 1991. That's a full 8 years before Columbine happens, right? So that means there are enough school resource officers across the country with conferences, training materials, leadership, and the like, 8 years before Columbine. And then again, we've already talked about this temporary uptick in crime in the 1990s. And who were the primary targets in the war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on drugs? It was Black youth. And so in 1994, in the crime bill, we've got the creation of the federal framework, Cops in Schools framework, which is the framework that has been used ever since to funnel federal dollars into the funding of police officers in schools. So at least the framework was created in the mid-90s. Then Columbine happens in 1999. And indeed, all of a sudden you see this influx of money into that framework that was already created. And where do the police officers go once that funding has been funneled in? They go to schools that have a predominantly African or disproportionately presence of Black and Latino and Latina students. This is really critical. They don't go to the middle-class suburbs of Columbine and Sandy Hook. right?
Right.
They don't go there. And so this is where we get that proliferation of police officers in schools. And so you ask, well, what does that mean for, for young kids? We know that more police in schools means more arrest in schools. More arrest in schools means more arrest of Black and brown students, and more arrest of Black and brown students for those minor normative adolescent behaviors. And so, I'm very sympathetic to teachers, right, in the school system. And but what has happened is that we then abdicate, right, our responsibility. Teachers then, give over their power and responsibility for routine discipline to police officers, to law enforcement. Law enforcement have never been and the research shows to this day, very few police departments have any adequate training, when they have training at all, but any adequate training around the adolescent development, de-escalation strategies, the things that are necessary for to appropriately intervene. First of all, that's because police officers shouldn't be in that business, right? It's just we, as opposed to bringing in behavioral specialists, social workers, mental health providers, all of those things that have been proven to be more successful in working with young people. So we're actually terrorizing, and I don't even mean to be inflammatory. The empirical research shows that there is a real traumatic effect on Black and brown people or young people in their adolescent years through this hyper surveillance and aggressive policing of Black and brown youth.
I almost want to push you to say this again, because, as we're having these discussions about law enforcement outside of schools and how ill-equipped they are to deal with certain kinds of challenges, we're talking about police officers who are in school who have no pedagogical training,
right?
Who have no background in adolescent psychology.
That's right.
Right. None of that. Right. So they're basically literally just cops now policing children.
Right. And even if they're officer friendly, even if, right. So there's a range of officers. There've been surveys, with officers about why they choose to go and work in the school system, and some of them, there is a percentage of them who go because they want to work with young people, but they're not skilled. They're not trained. And in fact, the way they are trained is they're trained to be police officers. So they get the routine set of training in the academy, the police academy. And so they, as you say, don't get this unique nuance training around adolescent development and all that entails. And let me just say, yes, so the research has shown there are about 2% of police departments at one point, when a study was done, 2% of police departments who had any adolescent development training at all. Some now school resource officers do get specialized training, but even in reports as late as 2020, they show that much of that training is not, very little of that training, I should have said, is on the adolescent brain, psychosocial features of adolescence, which is impulsivity, peer influence, sensation seeking, risk taking, and then even less, it keeps going down and down, even less get trained in specialized, unique adolescent de-escalation strategies, and so many of them, of the school resource officers, are young officers who don't have teenage kids yet, things of that nature. And so here's what I say. It's that we need to rethink policing and figure out what police officers are uniquely equipped and trained to do, and then relieve them of all of those responsibilities that they aren't uniquely, trained to do. And so I think, policing in schools is just definitely one of those categories.
One of the things you talk about in the book, in relationship to police, is this idea that we can't talk back to cops.
Right.
Right. How many Black kids are told when they're kids, don't get into grown folks, conversations. It is a feature of being a teenager.
That's right.
That when someone tells you to do something, you ask why.
Right.
And if you don't get the answer that you believe is legitimate, right, you will either push it some more or walk away.
That's right. That's right.
But we have this feature that you talk about in law enforcement of contempt of cop.
Contempt of cop.
Right, this bastardization, right, of the contempt of court. Talk about this and how this is escalated in so many different situations for Black youth.
So journalists, sort of came up with this sort of concept, contempt of cop. And as you say, it's a play on the concept of contempt of court. So when you disobey or show disrespect for the court of law, it's contempt of court. And so now, the play on the term is contempt of cop. And so here's a classic contempt of cop scenario. Police officers stop someone, and the person perceives that the stop or the engagement is unfair and often racially discriminatory. And so what do? They speak out. They talk back either against the officer or against the stop in and of itself. An officer feels like this is a challenge or an affront to their authority. And so they assert their right. They try to reclaim the upper hand, or another way to look at it, it's the battle of the egos, right? Particularly when you're thinking about a teenage male and a police officer, sort of the battle of the ego. And so this concept of contempt of cop applies to adults as well as children. But let's think for a moment about how much more common and impactful it is when it involves an adolescent. What do we know about adolescents? They're impulsive, reactive, emotional. They don't think ahead to the pros and cons. Here's another thing. They are fairness fanatics. Right. It's not.
Don't I know that?
That right. You have two children, right? Children, they're fairness fanatics, and also they care about what their peers think. So don't let any encounter, go down in front of any encounter with the police, take place in front of their friends.
Right. And social media. Right.
And social media, that has a whole nother layer on it. So just think about how more likely it is for there to be this sort of battle, of the egos on the street when a teenager is involved. But this is also what I say. Look, the title of my book is The Rage of Innocence. And at a macro level, the rage of innocence is the rage that every single one of us should have anytime any one child is deprived of an opportunity to be a child. But that title also has some nuances. And this is one of those nuances, which is the rage of innocence is what happens when you tell a Black child over and over and over again that they're criminal, that they're a threat, that they're unworthy, they don't belong, that anyone with an ounce of dignity, self-respect, and humanity is going to speak out and resist those labels. And in fact, that's what we want them to do, right? We want them to recognize and be able to distinguish between, this discriminatory, this feeling of discrimination and their own self-worth. And so they speak out, and they speak out what? Like an adolescent in all the ways that I just said, impulsive, reactive, emotional, right? And so it sounds angry and it sounds aggressive when in fact it's just an assertion of their humanity and self-worth. And so we've got to officers, then arrest a child for speaking out and talking back when we really haven't trained officers to accept teenagers as who they are.
Especially when they're Black, right?
Especially when they're Black and they feel like, that they need to stand up and they're traumatized by these experiences that they've had on the street, they've had at school, that they've seen on television. And so, I talk about the freedom of expression. There's so much conversation today about freedom of speech, but we aren't giving Black children the freedom to speak, right? And, look, they don't have the words. Look, Mark, I said, look, they don't have the words to say to the officer, don't give a dissertation, officer, I am so dissatisfied with the way you're treating me. They don't say that. They react impulsively.
You mentioned that, Black children don't have the freedom to speak. Sometimes that's the case in their own households. And I'm thinking about, when I went to high school in New York in the 1980s, there was a registered nurse who, with her own money, published these little pamphlets called the Little Black Book. And it was a set of instructions for young Black men for their interactions with the cops.
That's right.
And the kind of ways in which we want our children to speak out this little pamphlet really discouraged us from doing that because, this is 2 years after Bernard Goetz, shoots, 5 boys in the New York City subway. She knew that we couldn't win the argument, right? So she was preparing us to survive the moment, right? Instead of losing our life in the moment. But you think about something like sagging. And sagging for me is like, it was the one of the most recent moral panics. Society was going to hell.
Right.
Right. Because primarily Black men and Latino men were wearing their pants below their ass.
Right.
Dropping my daughter off at Livingstone a couple of weeks ago, young Black man sagging and an administrator shies him, young man, pull up your pants. And it's funny, and there's some jest there and there's some back and forth, right? But in what ways do respectability politics within the Black community, right, make us complicit in the ways that Black youth are demonized in these institutions, right? Because in many of these schools that you're talking about Black teachers, Black administrators, Black police officers that co-sign, in some cases, the way Black youth are being treated.
Yeah, really good question. I think about, I try to grapple with this in the book in ways that I try to be more nuanced and understanding about the real challenge that Black parents face. And so when I think about respectability, I think about it in several different ways. One of which, I think about respectability politics in the least favorable way is, Black folks achieve success and they become uppity and want to disassociate and distance themselves from, the folks who haven't made it. But that's such a little part, it's such a small part of what I think about when I think about respectability politics. I think the story that you told about the woman with her pamphlets is really, in many ways, it's about a parent's desire or elders' desire to keep Black and brown children, Black children safe, right? In light of all of the realities that we face. And so you tell your Black child to pull up their pants and to speak properly and to don't talk back and to know your place and be demure and, put your head down and be respectful as a way to survive. Here's the problem though. Black children today, and even in the civil rights era, they realized pulling up my pants, wearing my Sunday suit didn't prevent us from being water hosed in the civil rights era, right? So it's not working. So I think
bombed in a church, right?
Right, exactly. Bombed at a church, exactly. Right. And so that it's not working. So you have a hard time getting young people to accept and to buy into the respectability, politics of it all. And so what we find though is the parents, Black parents have such a difficult tightrope to walk. And I try to talk about that a bit in chapter 5, Black adolescent identity development, and the ways in which Black parents, on the one hand, have to prepare their children for these inevitable moments of discrimination and potential violence, right? In order to keep them safe. But at the same time, we can't over prepare them so that they are constantly afraid and triggered and hypervigilant and living with, a pervasive fear and anxiety. And also so that they don't live in a world in which they believe that there are no allies at all, when in fact, we know that there are some allies. So we live in a multicultural world in which they have to operate. And so it's a really delicate balance. And so one of the ways in which we think about as Black parents, balancing that is how do we bolster them? How do we say, okay, yes, there are these pocket of folks who are going to treat you badly, poorly, exclude you, discriminate against you, but that is not a statement of who you are. And so that it's that bolstering of Black history, of Black achievement, of self-worth, and that, reminding Black children that they're valued and that they're worthwhile, notwithstanding these other messages that are getting. So they're being able to hold together, we call these opposing ideas at one time. And so that's exactly what, during adolescence, it's that ability. Everything is no longer black and white. It's a balancing of competing realities in ways that allow for healthy adolescent development. So you can realize that white people have power, but Black people are powerful too. You can hold those two competing concepts at one time. So that's sort of the challenge of Black folks. And yeah.
What impact has writing this book had on you?
Oh, it was a lot more difficult to write than I anticipated for several reasons. One, so, I've been doing the work for, 26 years at this point. And I realized that, I don't even know when I started doing this, but that I had a folder. It started off, I'm old. It started off as a hard copy folder of police reports that I thought were what I call shock and awe cases. Cases that should cause all of us, why is this kid in the system? Why are we responding in this way to this behavior? So I would have those cases, and then now it's an electronic folder. So, I get assigned to a case or get it appointed to represent a young person. And I, sort of keep tabs on these sort of what I call shock and awe cases. And then so as I realized that I was going to write this book, I began to go back and look at some of those cases. And as I was reading them and reliving them, I was experiencing truly secondary trauma. And I kept thinking, wow, I'm like, having a moment rereading this. Imagine, right, what it must be like to be the child or the family member who was living through that in that moment. So that was one thing, which just really a wake-up call. I've always talked to my clients about their trauma and their experiences, but really going back and looking at those cases made me realize just how traumatic some, pockets of our community, live, how traumatic their experiences are. And then I began to do, the research that further demonstrates the trauma. But in addition, it was really hard to write this book, as you know, Mark, because I have some biographical pieces in this. It is almost impossible to be a Black in America and not be impacted in some way personally by the criminal legal system. And indeed, I have a brother, who absolutely got eaten up, in the system in ways. And so I talk about that at various points in the book, but especially in chapter 11. And it was paralyzing to write about that. I didn't realize how much trauma I had, within me around that, unresolved. And it took me forever to get through that chapter. And I have a brother, another brother, a third brother, a second brother, who it took me forever to get permission from him. I'm like, look, I'm about to tell the story about our other brother, and I need you to see it before the book comes out, kind of thing. So it was a lot of trauma. And then the third way in which it was a very traumatic experience, because I give voice to both the young people in my cases, but also to the young people and the families in some of these high profile cases that we've all heard about, right? Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, Jordan Davis, Jordan Edwards. And so I wanted to honor those voices, not, speculating what it must be like. So I forced myself to watch interviews, news interviews, radio shows, documentaries, hearing them speak about these issues. And I got to tell you, Mark, it was so painful. There were nights when I just sobbed. There were nights when I had nightmares. It was just really difficult to pull those stories out and tell those stories in the voices of the mothers and the fathers and the aunties and grandmas of folks and siblings, I understand, of folks who were impacted in that way.
We've been joined today by Professor Kristen Henning, who is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of Juvenile Justice Clinic, an initiative at Georgetown Law where she supervises law students and represents youth accused of delinquency in the DC Superior Court. She has served as the law school's Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning from 2017 and 2020. She is a Duke University grad. So always great to have Duke folks on the show. And we talked to her today about her book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, which is published by Pantheon Books. of which Paul Butler writes, Rage of Innocence blesses readers with common sense solutions that provide hope that we can do better for our children and for our democracy. It has been wonderful talking to you, Professor Henning.
Thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you too, Mark.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.